I'm Dr. Winston Yort. I'm a software engineer, but I've also long had an interest in voting and voting systems. My province of British Columbia is holding a referendum on whether or not to switch to proportional representation from first past the post. So I'm making this series of videos to help voters, particularly those who share my conservative political inclinations, to make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. Many of my fellow conservatives are suspicious of proportional representation because they see it as revolution. They see it as throwing out our political system wholesale and replacing it with something completely different. This is not to say that conservatives are completely unwilling to entertain changes to our political system. Indeed, they're willing to reform it. They just simply are unwilling to consider throwing it completely away. However, as I see it, proportional representation isn't revolution. It isn't a throwing away. It is in fact a reform. It is in fact a relatively small change to our political system, and one that is actually in keeping with the spirit and intentions of how our system of government is supposed to function. A theme in these videos has been me arguing that proportional representation is not as different from the status quo as we are led to believe. Indeed, I think that many proponents and opponents of proportional representation have an exaggerated sense of the degree to which proportional representation would change our political system. I've shown that we see coalitions in both first past the post and proportional representation. I've argued it doesn't change who has the political upper hand in BC. And I've argued that most of the objections against proportional representation are to things which are inherent in democracy. They're present in both first past the post and proportional representation. Proportional representation would certainly introduce changes, but they're not as drastic as you might have first thought. Furthermore, proportional representation is not a crazy experiment that's being tried that's never been tried before. As I pointed out in the first videos, many other countries use proportional representation, including other countries which inherited a similar political tradition to ourselves. However, a key point is that I think that proportional representation, rather than being drastic and different from our political tradition, actually restores the way our political tradition is intended to function. Your MLA is supposed to represent you. And during the time this idea was invented, when you had relatively homogeneous communities with small populations, this probably made sense, that you could have plausibly had someone who would represent the interests of their community. Times have changed. This no longer makes sense. And now I think MLAs don't really represent their communities in the way they did or the way they are intended to. And I think choosing an MLA based on which party they belong to actually actively represents you, because you could actually choose at least the party your MLA comes from. And that MLA would actually represent you in a real way, which is no longer true in our current system. Furthermore, the intention of our parliamentary system is that Parliament decides things. They decide whether the government's doing a good job, and they fire them if they're not. They decide what the law should be. This is the intended functionality of Parliament. That's not how our Parliament actually works today, because today a majority government controls the legislature and can do whatever it wants. That's not how Parliament is intended to work. That leads to a situation where all the decisions are made in the party structure, whereas those decisions are supposed to, in our system, be made in Parliament. Our system is called responsible government because the government is supposed to be responsible to the Parliament. However, this doesn't really happen when the government actually controls the Parliament by having a majority there. So as I see it, proportional representation is not that drastic a change. It has lots of precedent being used even in similar political systems to us, and it's actually a restoration of the way that our parliamentary system was intended to function, but which has over time been lost with changing times. As you can tell by now, I'm in favor of proportional representation, at least in principle. Now, I say in principle because I'm less sure about this particular referendum. Up to this point in time, I've been talking about proportional representation in principle to give you an idea of the pros and cons of proportional representation as I see them. In the forthcoming series of videos, I'm going to be looking more closely at this referendum in particular and why I'm less sure about this referendum than about the general idea of proportional representation.